Okay, so we're now coming up on the end of the war. We know it kind of all began with the presidential election of 1860. Very first Republican ever to run for president, Abraham Lincoln. South Carolina says we will not be part of a country that has a Republican as president. Well, Lincoln wins the election, and South Carolina does exactly what they threatened to do. They secede, and six more states join them. The war does not officially start until the attack on Fort Sumter, after which four more states secede. We now have 11 states in the Confederate States of America, and Abraham Lincoln makes it his mission to bring his country back together again. We know lots of things happen, but we know for the first part of this war, things are not looking good for Lincoln. He cannot find a good general. It goes through General McLazy, who loses the Battle of Bull Run, then General McHesitant, who can't defeat Lee at the Battle of Antietam. He goes through general after general after general. A new purpose to this war is put into place with the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. But we get our two turning point battles in July of 1863, just days apart. July 3rd, 1863, Union gets their first victory in the Battle of Gettysburg. And over in the Western Theater, Ulysses S. Grant is finally able to take over the Mississippi River on July 4th, the very next day at the Battle of Vicksburg. At this point, Abraham Lincoln realizes he needs General Ulysses S. Grant to leave the West and come to the East to defeat Robert E. Lee. Unfortunately, he won't come alone. Well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, but we know throughout the war the goal is to defeat the capital of the enemy, and that is something that has been happening or attempting to be happening all along. We learned about the ironclad battle, which ends in a stalemate after 4 hours of boom, 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 ding, ding, ding. All right, so we've got General George Meade, who wins the Battle of Gettysburg, first Union general to defeat Robert E. Lee, and Lincoln fires him anyway for not chasing down Robert E. Lee and crushing the Confederate Army once and for all. He decides he wants to bring Ulysses S. Grant over to the east to try to defeat the big Robert E. Lee, but Ulysses S. Grant says, listen, I'll come if I can bring my friend William Tecumseh Sherman with me. And Abraham Lincoln isn't too fond of this idea. He doesn't necessarily agree with the way Sherman runs his army, but he agrees anyway. And that is going to lead to 1864. And one of the big events of 1864 is Sherman's March to the Sea. So let me kind of explain to you what General Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant do. So we've got Grant and the Union Army in Washington, D.C. We've got Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army in Richmond, Virginia. Now, we talked about the fact that the South doesn't have a lot of factories and railroads, but while they don't have many, they do have some. Most of the factories and railroads in the South are in the city of Atlanta, Georgia. And General Sherman realizes that if they can get rid of the help that Atlanta, Georgia is giving to the Confederate Army, it might help the Union win this war. So General Sherman brings part of the Union Army to Atlanta and essentially burns Atlanta to the ground, destroys the factories, destroys the railroads. But General Sherman realizes it's not just about destroying things. He also wants to destroy the South's desire to keep fighting in this war. And the way to do that is to basically destroy the South. And so, what General Sherman does, which goes exactly what we were saying Lincoln would not like, is he decides to line up his army 65 miles wide, and he has them march over 250 miles from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. And Sherman's men are under direct orders: destroy everything in the path, destroy railroads, burn crops, destroy barns, free slaves. If a Confederate gives you any trouble, feel free to destroy their home. He does things that are definitely against Lincoln's liking, but it works. They not only have destroyed Atlanta, this march to the sea also allows General Grant to do what they've been trying to do all along, and that is to burn and destroy Richmond, Virginia, which is like the double punch here. So this becomes Sherman's march to the sea, burning everything in the pathway and destroying the South's will to keep fighting. So at this point, Abraham Lincoln's strategy, the blockade of the South, the Anaconda Plan, it's really working. And unfortunately, as we go into 1865, Robert E. Lee has no choice. It's time to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant. The two men meet up in a home of someone in a place called Appomattox Courthouse. And Robert E. Lee isn't sure what's going to happen when he gets to this building. He isn't sure if he's going to be arrested or what. But it turns out they shake hands because they're old friends. You know, every one of these generals all went to West Point. And so they sit down and they talk. And General Grant offers Robert E. Lee very fair terms of surrender. Basically, if you remember, Lincoln isn't fighting the South out of hatred. He's fighting them out of love for his country. He basically says, listen, you guys can come back, take an oath of allegiance, promise to come back to our country, follow the Constitution, and we'll give you all of your rights as a citizen. And it was very, very fair terms of surrender. And it was just that simple, a 90-minute talk. And officially the war is over. Now, unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln will not get to see the benefits of all of his efforts in the Civil War for very long because just 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln is going to be assassinated, which will be in a whole other video, which is a very interesting story. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Civil War. Now, we did talk about what happened to some of our main characters after the war. Let's talk about Robert E. Lee. After the war, Robert E. Lee was not arrested or punished, but he did lose the right to vote and he did lose some of his property. Part of his plantation is the land that is today the Arlington National Cemetery, where veterans for our country can be buried, which is pretty interesting. He goes on to become the president of a college called Washington College, which gets renamed Washington and Lee College, and this college is in Virginia. Unfortunately, he dies of a stroke just 5 years after the Civil War ends, and then dies of pneumonia at the age of 63. So that's kind of the future of Robert E. Lee. Ulysses S. Grant, very different after the war. Following the war, Ulysses S. Grant became a national hero, and in 1866, a year after the war, he was appointed America's first four-star general at the recommendation of the new president that took over for Lincoln when he was assassinated, Andrew Johnson. At the age of 46, he becomes the youngest president in U.S. history up to that time. There's been a younger president since then, but at that time, he was the youngest ever to become president, and he'll go on and serve 2 4-year terms. While he's in office, he does awesome things. He signs legislation for the Department of Justice, the Weather Bureau, which is now the National Weather Service, and he creates our very first national park, Yellowstone National Park out west. Later in his life, he ends up moving to New York to make money. He wrote a book about his life. He wrote an autobiography. He ends up dying of throat cancer about 20 years after the war, also at the age of 63. Things did not end so well for Confederate President Jefferson Davis. He was charged with treason, crimes against your country after the war, and he went to prison for 2 years. While he was in prison, he didn't do very well physically and emotionally, and he never really was the same after he was released. He and his family left the United States and traveled for 2 years, but when he returned to America, he had a hard time getting a job and making money to support his family. He tried to publish a book about the history of the Confederacy, but no one really wanted to read it. He ended up living off the charity of friends and relatives until he died in 1889. He refused to take the oath of allegiance to regain his citizenship. So that is kind of the what happened to those famous Civil War characters.